Doing well.
Yeah, good day. It's been a good day. Long day, but a good day.
Well, Lisa, I'll go let you go first.
I did a blend for benefit for USBG and for the children of restaurant employees. It's called You'll Never Walk Alone, and I poured some of that. It's been so much time evaluating the Widow Jane whiskey that it's fun just to pour it and just sip it sometimes.
Well, we batched a lot of barrels this fall, so I've got a lab sample of our 4-year-old rye that's actually 4.5 years old. So we'll be the oldest release when we release it soon. It's funny you ask, because last Thursday I had a couple of old friends that I have known since we were 13, and they came by to look at the distillery, and we did a little sample of that barrel. It's really fantastic. It's 2 years old now, so that project, hard to believe, Lisa, was 2 years ago.
It is hard to believe. Yeah, this year doesn't count, right?
Yeah, here you find.
Yeah, this is actually, Widow Jane, we haven't had any visitors for so long. We're all getting a little bit squirrely, and we already had lights on the barrels, but Sienna, one of my distillers, because we're social distance at all of our desks, her desk was under there, and somehow she like Snoopy Dog housed it. And and I don't know how to undo it. If that makes her happy at her desk, that's I can accommodate it.
Cheers. Yeah, James Anderson's the key man, and he was from Inverkeithing, Scotland, and immigrated to Virginia in 1791 with his whole family, 6 or 7 kids. And it's interesting because to immigrate at that age with a large family was a big move. And I think one of the aspects that affected him was the taxation of Scottish spirits that had been implemented in the late 1780s. And he came to Virginia, built another distillery south of here, which we're researching, and then got the job as George Washington's farm manager in 1797. And one of the first letters he writes him is, you need to build a distillery, and it'll complete your farm business plan. And with Washington's 8,000 acres, his merchant and grist mill, Anderson realized there's a lot of profit to be made. And although interested, Washington was pretty frugal with money. And so that initial letter, Washington says, it's a business I'm wholly unacquainted with. And he let him go forward with it, but he didn't start by building this new building. He wrote him and said, you can use the cooperage next to the grist mill to make whiskey in. So they installed 2 stills there in 1797, made about 600 gallons that first year. And as everyone knows, I think most everyone knows, whiskey was not barrel aged in the 18th century. So that went right to town in Alexandria, which meant cash came right back. So really the profits that were there was what inclined Washington toward moving into a larger operation. And so in the fall of 1797, he begins construction of a 75-foot by 30-foot distillery with 5 stills. So for that day and age, that's a pretty large facility. And the production of those last 2 years of his life, 1798, about 4,500 gallons, 1799, just a hair under 11,000 gallons of whiskey, with small amounts of peach and apple and persimmon brandy thrown in there as well. Yeah, that's one of the benefits being, if you're in the history business, you always look for primary sources. And I've worked at other museums or even estates in Virginia, and a lot of the records are lost. But Mount Vernon, many of them survived. So we have the ledgers, the letters between Washington and Anderson. And so you can go right back to the original documents. That combined with the archaeology that was done on site, because the original distillery burned down in 1814. So Mount Vernon did a 6-year dig and really uncovered all the features. In fact, Lisa and I was sharing some photographs and some of the documentation with her recently, because we always think about other aspects of what went on there to try to figure out what we're doing. And we know there was a malt house. It's something we're thinking about for the future and where that would have been. So with any history, you're always digging. You're always looking for how the story should be upgraded to be the most accurate it can be. And we find stuff in the ledgers all the time. And in fact, I recently discovered that Washington was getting some rye for the distillery from Maryland. And we all know the history of Maryland rye. So like any farm back then, he had to sometimes go outside to get what he needed.
I've switched microphones, so I'm hoping this sounds a little bit better and that everybody can hear me now. So let's fast forward a couple of hundred years to the Restoration. Obviously, everybody knew that he was in the business and they knew where the distillery was, but it was sort of lost to the ages after it burned in 1814, right?
Yeah, and the grist mill too, which is right next door, it was torn down in the 1850s. So if you rode your horse past that farm 1880, most people probably never knew what went on there on such a large scale. So the state restored the grist mill in 1932, and then Mount Vernon took over this little park in 1995, restored the grist mill, did the archaeology, and what they realized was there's a story here that has to be told. And so back then, Peter Cressy was in charge of Discus, and Dennis Pogue, who was the preservationist at Mount Vernon, got in touch with Discus, and they were able to help us raise the money to rebuild the distillery. And it opened up in 2007. That's when I came on board. So I missed a lot of the early fun stuff that they did outside. A lot of people know they had a still made by Vendome. Mike Sherman and his team made it. It was a copy of a 1790s still, and they set that up outside by the mill. And they did small batch runs in 2003, 4, and 5 to raise money. And Jimmy Russell was there, Mike Sherman, Dave Pickrell was there, Joe Dangler, others of note. And I feel sad I missed all that. I was working at another place, but I know the story. And that was really the inklings of the beginnings of that perhaps Mount Vernon could bring back George Washington's whiskey.
And as I recall, there had to be a lot of special dispensations from the state government to let this even happen. Because the idea was to sell the whiskey to raise money for the educational programs at Mount Vernon.
That's right. And we're still in the Virginia ABC system. I mean, we're still taxed the same as any other distillery in Virginia. And so we're all part of that. But the whole point of it is to tell the story, but also what we do make on our bottles feeds the preservation education mission. And in a normal year, Mount Vernon gets 1 million visitors and a lot of school kids. And not every school group teacher wants to go through the distillery. They all go through the grist mill. And our joke is, when they come to Mount Vernon, we want to make sure they leave knowing about tobacco and alcohol, which are, the two key commodities of the 18th century. But really, our goal is to teach a lot of different life lessons about history and who lived and worked at Mount Vernon and what went on the estate and how Washington ran his farms.
And we'll get to some of that in just a second. But Lisa, you took over a few years ago for the late, great Dave Pickrell, who was the one of the original consulting distillers from the industry. How'd you wind up getting connected into Mount Vernon?
Yeah, you know what? Steve and I were talking because he was going over some stuff like one of the things that I have these theories, and then he goes and does the research to see if the theories, hold any truths, just out of practicality, right? Yeah, it's been almost 5 years in March, which is crazy. I was distilling for Ted Huber at Starlight Distillery in Southern Indiana, and a gentleman that was working at Mount Vernon at the time came for a tour. And Ted couldn't do the tour, and he said, "Will you do this?" And we started discussing things. He was telling me they were fermenting in wood barrels. They were having some issues. I'd fermented in wood barrels when I was distilling for Steve Beam at Limestone Branch, and I said, "Oh, well, you might want to try this and try that." And he said, "You know what?" At the end of the tour, he's like, "I need to talk to this guy, Steve Bashore, and see if you can come out." And I asked Ted Huber, I'm like, "Can I?" Because I was distilling 6 days a week. I said, "I'd really like to have an entire weekend off so that I can go out to Mount Vernon after they got everything approved." And Ted's like, "No." I'm like, "What? Okay." And he's like, "No, Lisa, go for 4 or 5 days." He said, "You're going to get out there. You're going to love it." And that was the understatement of my career. yeah, so yeah, and we got in there and rolled up our sleeves and got some stuff done. So it's been really incredibly rewarding. I love history anyway, so it's I don't know why, but it's been good fortune that it seems to come second nature. But yeah, it's all the best things ever, right? It's copper and wood and fire and water and grain, and yeah, it's all the best stuff.
And when you say fire, you mean literally fire, because the stills are hand fired
Yes, there's
and tended by guys that are wearing period clothing, which I'm sure is probably not quite fireproof, Steve. But
Well, we're not in that every day, but often there's film shoots that go on, and if we're in production, the guys get to wear, and girls get to wear their regular clothes, and I get to disappoint them as the boss and say, "Hey, we got a film shoot Tuesday, so everybody's got to be in period clothes." And we do that during the season, but we can scale back when we're actually in production in the off season.
and the season starts up again, tourist season, theoretically in April, hopefully, right?
Hopefully, yeah. Mount Vernon Estate is open 365 days a year, but the mill and distillery is April through October. And if you've been in an old mill in December, you know why. It's quite cold, and we use that for maintenance and production time.
And you're getting ready to do some maintenance now, right? Vendôme's coming out next week. Explain what has to happen to keep a historic distillery running these days.
Well, because of the direct fire on the bottom of those stills, we get them checked regularly for degradation and the thickness of the copper. And so Mike Sherman's they were involved in the project from the beginning. And so they've come out and checked them. And we have an issue with one of the stills where we think there might be a small pinhole somewhere at the top, and we're going to get that checked. And so all that brick that surrounds the firebox, we had to break all that down off the top. And so it's not just, walking up to a copper vessel and looking at it. So after they check them, the guy that repairs the mill, Gus Kiorpis, the millwright, is also a great mason. And he helped build the mill. So I'm lucky in that I have a guy that knows these buildings intimately. And so he and I become good friends over the years, and I'll just give him his list, and then he'll tell me what he thinks we need to do, and he'll take care of it. And then also Corey, my head miller, is also a mechanic and a welder. So me being the historian, I can repair certain things, but I have two aces in the hole, which probably every distillery needs, because there's work that takes accomplished skills to do. And so with them, we take good care of it. And also at this time of year, we're repairing the grist mill. So that grist mill is a water-powered machine that's made of wood. So Gus is working on that as well. So that way during the season, unless there's some anomaly, we don't have any issues.
I started this morning on the floor with a hacksaw.
So you're fulfilling that little cartoon about what distillers' families think their life is like, right? Yeah.
So what were you doing with a hacksaw, Lisa? What had to be fixed up in Brooklyn?
We are moving things around, and there were some bolts in the floor that no matter what, were not budging. And so I grabbed the hacksaw and just cut them off. So no one would trip on them, right?
Well, yeah, typical distillery maintenance work. I mean, if it's going to be stuck, you just take a hacksaw to it and cut it off and deal with it.
Yeah, I know. I see Becky's on there. Hey, Becky. But yeah, I know she knows.
Yep. Becky Harris from Catoctin Creek is on there, and she recommends the distillery, as do I. I think if you're interested in whiskey history, this is one of the few places where you can see how it was done back in the day, 200 some years ago. And on that note, our pal Nurse Dave wants to know, how do you control the temperature of the liquid in the still with a wood fire? It's not like a boiler where you can just turn a knob and raise the heat or lower it as you need to.
Yeah, that was a real learning curve. And Lisa was around for part of that because we have a really good friend named Mark Meltonville, who's quite the character. He was the food historian for the Royal Palaces for about 25 years. So this gentleman ran Henry VIII's kitchen. It's at Hampton Court Palace and knows fire. And he came to visit and work with us, and he pointed out that the size of the wood you're feeding there and how you're laying it in the firebox is causing temperature spikes inside the still. And so the stream would come out the back and it would pulse. And when it pulses, you put your hand there, you feel vapor, you're losing alcohol. So we realized from Mark's teaching about how to feed the fires properly and even out the flow out the back of the still to maximize the run. And it's really just at first trial and error and then practice. The other difficult thing is every still runs a little different. They all have their own personalities. The two by the main door run different because the cold air comes in. Just like the fermentation floor, we have a window on that side, so the fermenters at that back corner act differently than the ones. And Lisa's told me about her wonderful warm conditions at Widow Jane, so I know she knows this in the modern sense too, because they have a lot of challenges in Brooklyn and the older facility that they're in. So it's kind of interesting, Lisa. There's a parallel in a strange way with you're used to working at Mount Vernon in the cold, but you certainly have to do it up there.
Explain, Lisa. You were telling us this before we went on the air.
Yeah, the building that I inherited when I started this project, we're sharing it with bottling and distilling and everything else. And it's not unusual. I mean, back when I was at Limestone Branch, we didn't have any heat or cooling there either, and Starlight, we had minimal because it's just it's an energy suck, right? Try to keep yourself comfortable while you're, distilling and everything. So, we all, make sure that we put lots of layers on and I bought everybody fingerless gloves for Christmas.
But you said you had the thermometer in your office on your desk and it was 39 degrees in there?
Because I don't technically have an office because we all are everywhere. And it was 39.2 degrees. I wish I hadn't laid the Fahrenheit, not Celsius. I wish I hadn't laid the thermometer on my desk. But yeah, it was a bit brisk last week. And, you just deal with it, right? There's some days that are more challenging than others, but I have an amazing team and everybody's pretty hardy. It's so interesting, to be a New Yorker. I am not a New Yorker. I'm a Kentuckian, right? And used to be a Hoosier, just like Mark. And, the people up here are pretty amazing, dealing with all the climate changes and everything as they happen here. So yeah, I got a pretty sturdy crew. My husband worked in Antarctica and fuel systems, so he's still in like a regular shirt.
We have a question from Alan Winchester, our pal at the Glenlivet, who wants to know if the beer stills have rummagers, the stuff inside that stirs everything to keep the wash and everything from burning on the bottom of the stills. Steve, Lisa, can one of you handle that one?
Yeah, go ahead, Steve. I'm sorry.
Well, it's interesting that we've sometimes learned we were doing things right after we did them and then read 18th century books on distilling. And one of the things we found in there is when you first fill the mash, not in the double run, but in the mash run, stir that as you're building your fire continually. And then we found in a book, it recommended that. It was a 1760s book. And when you see a wisp of vapor coming, cap the still and carry on. So we had figured that out on our own. But we also have to row mash by hand, so we're kind of used to rowing.
And you guys stir everything and do everything by hand down there. You don't even have a pump, I think, to pump the stuff around, do you?
We do have a little pump, and we only use it on spirit runs because it just speeds up the mornings. But everything else is bucketed or rowed by hand.
Question now from Chris Ratcliffe. How many distilleries were there in Washington's time? Was it more smaller farm distilleries or just a few big legal ones? And I think the number would probably shock some people.
Yeah, by 1810, so a little past Washington, there were close to 10,000 distilleries in Virginia and Maryland alone. And granted, many are these farm distilleries where it was a partial run through the year. Maybe the farmer had one or two stills. But there were quite a number of large ones throughout the early states, at the early colonies. As rum starts to become less of the main product of America, the whiskey distilleries predominate. And so through the research that the team did at Mount Vernon, they found one distillery that had 8 stills in the 18th century. So I believe, and Lisa and I have chatted about this, there's a lot more not known that's out there somewhere in these little archives or libraries, because remember, everything's not digitized. So I was digging with another friend the other day, and we're looking down various avenues to find out more about 18th century distilleries. But I think it was prevalent, and I think that we'd be amazed at how large some of them were.
John Kalinowski asks, if you use a period-appropriate method to determine when the methanol is exhausted and your ethyl alcohol stream starts, he heard back during a visit to Oban that mixing in ice water was how they used to do it. How do you decide, or do you go ahead and just use a hydrometer and make a concession to modern times?
Well, Lisa's taught us this, that we go by smell and taste as it comes off heads. And she's been really good at coaching us and helping us understand that. But maybe you could speak a little more to that, Lisa, because your experience with that. But you've done it with us and see how we do it.
Yeah, I mean, you got it. You got it. Yeah, it's all sensory.
And they did know about that back then. These distilling books reference this. They understood that. So not everybody, we make the assumption that because it was 1780, everybody was just pouring everything into the barrel. I'm sure some did.
Luckily, poison tastes bad. So, right?
Right.
So Dave Kuhn wants to know, where do you get your water from for the distillery? The Potomac is considered notoriously dirty, according to Dave, but the water comes from just the streams that flow through the estate, right?
Well, the cooling water does. So just as they did in the 18th century, the water trough off the mill race brings the cooling water in for the condensers. They had a freshwater well they put in behind the distillery when it was built. We have main city water that comes in, but we have a filtration system that is modern that we clean that water up before it goes in the boiler. So I always like to say we're about 90% 18th century, but there's things we must do, to comply with what's appropriate.
And you can see in the picture, I think this is the race that comes in from the grist mill, or brings the water in, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, that's the trough. And then the wellhead is behind the building right there. With it's a faux well today, but that's where they did bring in the fresh water back in the 18th century.
Now we should talk about you alluded to the history, obviously, and we need to address the question in the room because it is an open secret that George Washington did own slaves. And there were 6 of them, according to historical records, that worked at the distillery, right?
Yeah, they were. And it was the lucky thing is we have those records. So we know the name of these young men that worked there. And we know their ages. They were all single. One was a boy of 14 named Timothy. But they're listed as at the distillery along with some coopers that worked there as well. The grist mill, there was always a paid miller, but there was an enslaved man named Ben that ran the grist mill. So that's part of our teaching every day at Mount Vernon as we give tours and visitors come, is to tell the entire story of how the plantation worked and the critical role of African-American men and women who did a range of work at Mount Vernon, not just distilling, but textiles, plowing. There were skilled carpenters, brick masons, etc. So because Washington was a record keeper, we know the names of everybody that lived and worked at Mount Vernon. And we often know the familial relationships, which is kind of interesting. And as history marches on, things come full circle. And what's interesting is a few years ago, the head of our Mount Vernon Inn and dining room was a direct descendant of a Mount Vernon slave. And so, Jay Quander was his name. So the Quander family still live locally. And we do events regularly around African-American history at Mount Vernon. And Jay ran the restaurant for several years and had many great conversations with him about his family and his memories from his elders that told him about what memories they had that was passed down through the family.
And obviously that is something that really needs to be taught, and we don't hear enough about it because it wasn't just Mount Vernon. It was distilleries all up and down the East Coast and back into the pioneer areas into what are now Kentucky and Tennessee, where we had enslaved people working in the distilleries. And I think we're really only now just starting to scratch the surface of being able to tell that story.
Yeah, and I think the most famous one in recent years is Fawn Weaver and her story with Nearest Green and Jack Daniels. So that's been good to see that story told. And funnily enough, last week I was digging through some old archives that have slave and indentured servants records, and I found a slave distiller from the 1750s.
Wow.
So I'm going to keep digging, because as I said earlier, a lot of these stories haven't been told, and it's peeling back layers and layers to find them. So I think more will come out, more will be written, and we'll learn more about the contribution of these folks that ran various industries. And I think whatever industry was going on in the colonies, you can bet there were African-American men and or women employed in that.
And it's something we need to give them credit for and honor their work, because realistically, we would not have had an American whiskey industry had we not, had it not been for the work they did at the time, and the contributions they made. And we need to remember that and
Yeah.
remember
Well,
these people.
when I think I've said this to Lisa in the past, when we first started making whiskey at Mount Vernon, I was stunned at how backbreaking it was to do it the way we do it. And I'd given a lot of tours, and then I thought about those young men. We make it for a few weeks a year, and then we shut down. They just kept going and going, and they achieved almost 11,000 gallons in 1 year. So I was blown away by thinking about how was their work week. Ours is tough, but I can imagine it would have been tougher to keep doing batch after batch after batch.
And they lived above the distillery, from what I understand, in the loft above the stills, right?
It's not in the records. We think they may have. I think they may have worked in shifts because of the amount of work involved. So there may have been 3 on while 3 were off. They could have also had log cabins nearby, which was how it was on most of the other farms at Mount Vernon for the enslaved population.
Question from Malt Mariners, and Lisa, you can handle this one. Explain the kind of whiskey you're making. Obviously, it's rye whiskey, but what all went into it back then, and what all do you make it with today?
It's not that different today than it was back in the day. They would have used some yeast that they had cultured on site, right? And we were using a commercial yeast because of the brief distilling period that we have and all of the crazy conditions. It's nice to have a yeast that makes really delicious whiskey, but can handle like high stress situations and temperature fluctuations and those sorts of things. Really, there's not a whole lot of difference. People ask me this, often, and we're talking about the fires getting regulated earlier. I mean, the fires can be moved as quickly as steam in a still. It's crazy, but you start to have like Steve was talking about the pulsing, and everybody's so skilled at the fires now. It can get remedied in just a matter of a minute. That we can get things smoothed out and operating the way they are. So, rye, bourbon. Last year, the smallest fermenters I set were at Mount Vernon, 120 gallons, and the largest ones I set were 11,000 gallons, and some in between. And there's really not a whole lot of difference. It's really interesting. I mean, grain comes in, and it used to come in a cart. Now it comes in a truck. It goes to some sort of milling process, whether it's a rolling mill or a hammer mill or a grist mill. People didn't have all the scientific things to analyze the grain, but they did have sensory. They knew if it was moldy, it was going to taste moldy when it made whiskey. It was a lot of similar practices that we use now. It's really fascinating that it is so similar. It's not that difficult to go to Mount Vernon and adapt from the day-to-day here or the day-to-day where I'm doing some other distilling in Kentucky.
And on that, Graham Fraser asks if the distillery can make a different range of styles, or does the technology, quoting there, limit that? You can make different whiskeys with different mash bills, but essentially it's one production method, right?
Yeah, we've made over the years a lot of rye, but we also made bourbon 2 years ago with Lisa's help, which was a great project. And we also made single malt whiskey many years ago with Bill Lumsden, Andy Cant, and John Campbell, along with Dave Pickrell. And we do brandies as well, peach and apple. And so we have a few other things I'd like to accomplish as we go forward. I think that's how it goes. You get so many years in and you start to think about, well, wait a minute, we can possibly pull this off. And one I've been thinking about is just something in the American whiskey category where we can just select some grains that we want to run with. So we also made rum a few years ago, which was a fun project with Lisa and Maggie Campbell. And so outside the portfolio, obviously, but years ago, Frank Coleman, who worked for Discus, wanted us to make tequila. And the preservation department said, no, Frank, we're not going to make tequila at Mount Vernon. So, yeah, there is a wall there at some point, but I look forward to seeing what we could pull off in the American whiskey category. And I'd love to revisit single malt whiskey because that was a very small project. And the way we've done special projects is that we then go back and do a larger run of it. And we've yet to try that with single malt, and I know perhaps we can entice Lisa to help us with that.
I think you can probably con her into that one too. Chris Ratcliffe,
Mark visiting too, right?
Yeah, and Chris Ratcliffe asks, you mentioned having to make some changes to the distillery when it was rebuilt. At what point does historical accuracy meet modern safety regulations? What sort of changes did you have to make to comply with current codes? I know there was some, you had to add about, 15 extra feet on to put an elevator in to meet the Americans with Disabilities Act requirements and things like that, right?
Right. And also some of our operational methods, like initially the first run, we used to drain slop into buckets out the back of the still, which presents some issues. And so we have a hose and modern piping we can hook up to the back of those copper stills. That when you go on a tour, you see a wooden spigot. We don't use the wooden spigots for draining. We also take real good care of high proof spirit. Doesn't stay in the main room when we're done distilling it. We have a fire system in there as well. We have a fire plan, escape plan, and we also go through training, which again, as you know, everybody knows, something can happen in an instant in a distillery with alcohol. So, and you know, the fact it's not lost on this, we have open fire. So, so all those things are put in there, but we're very careful with our equipment. And that's why, like I said earlier, Vendôme's coming to inspect those stills next week. And that's just a regular part of our safety plan.
We had some comments about that single malt that you did with the guys a couple of years ago for the 10th anniversary. When might it hit a bottle at some point?
Well, we have to plan out the next 2 years. You know, we're kind of unable to do a normal run in there now because it takes 8 staff. So it's on the list, and you know, we'll pass you the word as soon as something's going to happen, because I think it's one of the ones we want to do soon. The original batch was 60 bottles, so it was really a fundraising project.
And that brings up a question from Graham Fraser about the distillery output. It's available to buy at Mount Vernon in the gift shops, right?
It is, and we're also in 12 Virginia ABC stores now, so we've spread out across the state a little bit. Our runs are so small, though, we're not at the point where we can distribute. But who knows? Maybe we can branch out to a few other states in time. Maybe they'll keep amending laws down the road where we could actually ship, because we can ship within the state of Virginia and into DC now. So as many good things happen, like with the FET reduction, maybe we can move in a direction down the road where distilleries are able to broaden their business in another way. But right now it's fairly limited release.
So did you send a bottle to the White House for the inauguration?
One of our upper staff may have, because that's happened before. You know, we get these visits from various dignitaries, and you show up at work and you know there's an issue because you see 19 black SUVs. And then you realize, oh, I can't go up to the admin building. Okay, I'll go back to the mill now. So we certainly are a site where people of both parties have come over the years, and you know, wonderful visits. You can see the photos going back to JFK. So I wouldn't doubt it if our CEO had sent something along.
John Burns has a question: the do's and don'ts of apple brandy fermentation.
Lisa?
Yeah, the do's and don'ts. Making sure you have the right yeast, right? You know, you have to have good in, good out, right? You've got to have, if somebody is making brandy from already made apple cider, or hard cider, if it's been sulfited, it's a really bad idea. You need to work, you know, trying to arrest that fermentation, thinking that somebody's going to use it for consuming it and not distilling it, you know, can be an issue. Steve actually ran some apple brandy this last fall for that very reason. And, you know, when I was writing out the list of what needed to happen, you know, I told him we needed to work quickly and in batches. We can bring it all on site because we didn't want it to turn, right? And, but wanted to keep those healthy, clean fermentations. So really after that, it's just good cleanliness and good distillation practices.
How do you keep the entire process clean when it's all wooden fermenters, wooden buckets, pretty much wooden everything? It's kind of hard to keep it clean.
That was the other part of the story that she kind of was nice and neglected, because when she came in March 2016, we met each other, and then we're working, and people say more with body language than they do with their words. So I'm looking over there and I'm throwing mash, and I could just tell something's wrong. Something's wrong. And I said, what do you think? And she goes, well, I'll talk to you tomorrow. And that was the beginning of a conversation about how we were handling these wood fermenters, cleaning regimen, also some other things with the mashing protocol itself, which over that period of 2016, Lisa wrote a new protocol for us, which we've carried on with. And that's really led to a lot of better whiskey, more whiskey, and cleaner distillations. And then fire management we've got better at, I would say. Wouldn't you think, Lisa?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the wood fermenters, we kind of use an old school caustic and scrub them out and, and spray something a little bit acidic on the inside of them to keep any kind of bacterial growth at bay. And yeah, you can definitely clean all of that stuff. I make them clean the floors and the walls.
Well, we're lucky to have this 18th century steam pressure washer. It's rare, but I'm sure Washington had one, and it does the trick on those fermenters, I'll tell you.
Yeah, I mean,
what were they doing, Lisa, before this?
You know what? Steve and I have talked about that, and he's the researcher, right? And so one of my things is I think they probably used lye water because because it was a caustic, right? They had all that ash, right? Very easy to make some sort of lye soap or lye water. And my guess is they would, because they knew instinctively that, white fuzzy stuff shouldn't grow on top of their, on their fermenters or whatever. But, trial and error, there are records where people have shown with it, they had more yield, when they had those healthier fermentations. And so, trial and error, right? Yeah. But that's my theory. My theory is I'd love if anybody knows any better than that, to tell me what they know. But that's what I suspect. So like I said, we use a caustic and scrub brushes, and I make them scrub out the corners. And then when I'm on site, I stick my head in every single fermenter to make sure it doesn't smell like anything before they get to set it.
Yep. True.
Yeah. I make their lives miserable.
Oh, that's not true. Only on some days.
Yeah, but we've increased yields. Healthy fermentations produce more alcohol, and no off flavors or, like I said, good in, good out.
That leads us to a question from Nurse Dave. What would it take, or could you ever increase production? The only way you could really do it would be to just run more production through, since you really can't expand, right?
Yeah, we've already made a huge jump. I mean, in the last 5 years, the yields went up, 53%, Steve?
Yep, 53. And a few years ago, I was getting pressured to make more. And I said, well, if you let me close the tours in October, we can. And they did that. Obviously our job is tours. Yeah. But I think we have a little bit of margin on the edge. We've gotten better, which means the efficiency buys more time. And so once we get past COVID, I don't know, we might see what we can do.
Yeah, without running a night shift, as I remind people too, when I show up, people ask me all these questions. All of this staff, they're all amazing, but they are historians the rest of the year. They're interpreters and historians, and they start turning into distillers when it's distilling season. So, they're a pretty remarkable bunch that they can remember from season to season what we're doing. But it's a lot of fun.
Lisa, if you only had a son in the area who could just go out there and work full time.
I know, right? Who needs to work on Capitol Hill these days?
Yeah, send him out to Mount Vernon. Yeah. Let him distill. Second generation here. He can do it. Yeah. Jordan can do it.
He has road mash at Mount Vernon.
He's run a lot of mash at Mount Vernon, yeah.
And run still, so.
Yeah, even so we can't make it out there, he's like, oh yeah, I talked to Steve, I'm going to go out and work this weekend. I'm like, oh, I'm so jealous, right?
Well, occasionally when you're both there, I look around, you're not in the main room. Oh, they're in the barrel room. I see. Okay. I understand.
Yeah. Where do you store the barrels with the maturing stuff? Because I know you don't store it at the distillery.
Well, there's some at the distillery because we've made so much the last few years, but I have a barrel storage rack on the estate down by the farm. And we're going to expand that at some point down the road because we just are making more, and we're aging in larger barrels now too. So we want it to go longer in those larger barrels. So that's kind of, as we look down the road a little bit, we hope we can increase storage.
And,
but I don't have nearly as many barrels as Lisa has at Widow Jane. I know that much.
Question from Dave Kuhn. Was distilling historically ever done at River Farm, which Washington also owned and is now the home of the American Horticultural Society? Do you know if they did distilling there?
There's no definitive record of that, but in the early years, Washington owned 2 stills that he acquired in the 1760s. They were smaller because he had orchards, and some of the orchards were out that way on River Farm. So it's not beyond the possibility that in a small farm building out there, they could have been making brandy from the apples. So just I always look for the primary source. That's just supposition, but there's reasonable, background that could happen out there, or could have happened out there.
Washington didn't drink his whiskey, though, did he? He was not a whiskey drinker, was he?
Well, he was a Madeira drinker, and he loved porter beer, and he loved champagne on occasion. But there is a couple of references to him having whiskey. The most famous one was a letter, I believe, by Henry Knox during the Whiskey Rebellion. And Washington led that army toward Western PA. And the letter states that he will drink the drink that's famous in those parts. So he certainly was partaking of it then. At the time of his death, there's whiskey in the basement of that mansion. So I would not doubt that on a time with guests in the dining room, he likely probably drank a little whiskey, but I would say he was more of a Madeira and porter beer man.
And of course, since he was selling that whiskey, if he was drinking it, he wasn't making any money from it.
I can see him thinking like that, yeah, knowing him, yeah.
Let's talk about the historic recipes from Washington's time. What did you find in the records what all did you find about what was being made at the distillery?
Well, a couple of interesting things. Initially, the research showed when they were doing the archaeology that there was references of grain going from the grist mill into the distillery. And so there was no mash bill written down, but the team led by Dennis Pogue and Esther White at the time, who was head of preservation and archaeology, they went through those records and they broke out the ratios, and that gave them about a 55 to 60% rye content, and the 30s on the corn, and then malted barley. Digging deeper the last few years, what led to the bourbon project was that in the first few distillations in the cooperage, they didn't have any rye on hand. And so they used wheat tailings and corn from the mill. So the mash bill we developed was a wheated bourbon mash bill that's about 70% corn and 20% wheat. And that goes right back to original record. And I think it speaks to distilling in that time, and probably early 19th century. You distilled what you had on hand. I think these clear definitions developed over time. And also there's some question about how much malt they were using in the first batch. And we have the records of the malt house. Lisa and I were talking about it not too long ago, and they may have been malting some rye for all we know. So, but it settled in on that rye, corn, and malt bill sometime in 1798. Otherwise, there's details like you wouldn't believe. I mean, carpentry details, the amount of board feet of the building, the stone was got from Great Falls on the Potomac. I mean, it's just great to read the record, because thank God he was meticulous, because if you worked for him, it probably drove you crazy. But as a historian, you look back and go, look at all this incredible detail. And so, I mean, you've studied the record some. I've sent you some of those, Lisa. What do you think from a mash perspective?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were some surprises in there. I thought I wasn't supposed to say some of that stuff. I thought you were still working on some of those. Yeah, I mean, my first time that I went through, they were gracious enough to, give me a PDF of the distillery ledger, and it ebbs and flows and evolves, at different places. There's some massive amounts of sugar at points. So yeah, it's interesting.
Well, I didn't let everything out of the bag. I just
I didn't think I was supposed to say anything. So now I feel like I'm really put on the spot. I'm like, is he gonna kill me if I say?
I learned recently they've put the digitized thing on the web, so I guess it's out of the bag. So.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
I won't tell you where. You have to dig for it, but it's
Yeah.
can't
Let's answer Chris Ratcliffe's question
Okay.
about aging. Typically, they weren't, were they?
No, no. But
This was going straight from the still to the pubs.
but I've often thought that when a cooper builds a barrel in the traditional way, it's put over a fire in order to heat that oak to bend it. And so my question's been, was there what we would call some form of very light toast on early barrels that wasn't done by purpose, only by construction purpose? And would that have affected the spirit at all?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And something else that's interesting with the distillate there, lots of times you'll get some in the white distillate, you'll get some smoke notes, and because it's a sponge, and so it's soaking up the wood fire, which I just find fascinating. But we all know about terroir, right? And why you have to keep the distillery clean, because you don't want the bad stuff like tainting all of that. But the hint of smoke, I just love that. So, especially in the bourbon.
Tor Christensen's asking from Norway, is there somewhere where people can read more about your findings? And I would assume some of that's at the Mount Vernon website, right?
Yeah, if you go to mountvernon.org, and if you go to the library page, the Fred W. Smith Library for the Study of George Washington, there are various menu pulls down, and you can go on the George Washington papers, the digital papers, and there's research material there that our historians have done, and you can search through that, and there's voluminous material there, and it's word searchable, the papers, so you could enter James Anderson's name, and it'll pull up all the letters between Washington and Anderson, and there's records there as well, and farm reports. So, and also Library of Congress. If you go to Library of Congress and George Washington papers, there's a whole nother set of them there.
And you mentioned this briefly before, but Alan Winchester wants to know where in Scotland James Anderson came from.
Well, he married into a wealthy merchant family that was centered in Inverkeithing, and the Spencerfield house where they lived is still there. And I got to visit that house in 2016, and the old dairy in the basement is where their wine cellar is now. So he married into a wealthier family. I'm not sure of his point of origin, but I think he was east of Inverkeithing is where he grew up on a farm that his father ran.
We have a suggestion now from John Burns that you should maybe open the tours to hands-on production to get consumers more involved and increase production in the long run. And I think if you charged them a bit, you might actually be able to make some money for the estate. Nurse Dave also points out that there's a winery in Napa Valley where you can pay to help them during the harvest and then have lunch in the vineyard afterwards.
That's up to Steve opening the distillery. That is not we've talked about it here, but there's so many safety concerns, right? That
well, the big L word of liability comes to mind because I've had me and other staff with some nice burns from that boiler and things. So yeah, we'd love to welcome people. That's what Mount Vernon's all about, is bringing people together. And we do brandy runs during the season sometimes when visitors can't come in and see because they're smaller runs. So we try to accommodate that because we know this industry is interesting to people and the history is interesting. So we do our best, but we have to also focus on it being safe in there. And I get a lot of requests all year long. Gee, if you need a helper in there, let me know. And it's I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, sometimes help isn't help, really, sometimes. But
Nurse Dave, I say yes. I saw your comment. Yes, record everything.
Yeah, write everything down. Keep better records of your drinking habits, at least for the documentation for your doctors at some point.
Yeah.
Bill Ricker points out that Brook Laddie used to have a pay-to-pay apprenticeship program, but the liability laws are looser over there.
Yeah, well, and it's one of my dreams. I mean, even here at Widow Jane, and right now we just don't have the time and the manpower. We are so fortunate that we are so busy, right? And but no, down the road, I would certainly love to, teach people hands-on distilling.
Well, in New York City, with all the lawyers in New York, that's a great idea.
I know. I was on the. That's what I did right before this. I was talking to our alcohol lawyer.
Well, so I can say that we have helped other distillers and craft distillers from time to time. Tim Welly, who runs Hill Rock, has been down years ago. Brian Cushing, who was at Locust Grove, the historic distillery in Louisville, he trained with us. So we do our part to with people that are, wanting to learn, but we just can't, open the doors to everyone.
Yeah.
And
It's
speaking of Widow Jane,
Yeah.
this came in during the holidays from Lisa and her friends. Tell us about this whiskey, because I've been waiting to open this because I knew you were coming.
Right.
I love this box. This is like a metal ammunition box.
Yeah, I'm so fortunate. Michelle Clark, she's our vice president, but she's also our art director, and she just knows everyone. So she had this constructed by a friend. It looks like a military ammunition box. It's technically supposed to be like a main malt box. So, but yeah, it's a blend of 15 to 17-year-old whiskeys. It's Tennessee and Indiana. I rebarreled it in some 5-year air season Appalachian oak out of Zach Cooperage. And yeah, and Mark, it really does need to open up. So give it, 5, 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll pour it now while we keep talking here.
Yeah, and it's the vaults projects for me are just labors of love. My day in, day out is our 10-year flagship. I blend across 3 states, and I have a lot more creative freedom with the vaults, and I love that. And 10-year is, I love it. It's 5 barrels. Where I've blended 340 batches of it now, and but so the vaults breaks away from that. It's still a small batch, but a lot more barrels. It's generally we've had a 14-year release last year, and then we had an 8-year-old air season wood last year, and then this year the 5-year-old Appalachian oak, and I blend between 21 and 24 barrels for these projects.
And when you talk 5 years, that's how long the wood was seasoning before it was coopered, not how long how old the whiskey is.
Correct.
Let's clarify that.
Yeah, I'm doing all kinds of wood trials, right? And it's just, oh my gosh, it's just absolutely delicious. The Appalachian oak. So many of them have the whole argument about terroir and whiskey, right? And it's just amazing what you can pull out of 2 pieces of wood that look identical.
How long? Because most barrels are made from, say, 18 to 24 month seasoned wood.
Yeah.
What do you get after 5 years of air seasoning?
It's absent of tannin, of any kind of green grape stemminess. Anything that's herbaceous is pretty much gone. Not pretty much, completely gone. So you're talking vanilla. You're talking, some campfire, and in my opinion, it matches some of since it's new cooperage, it matches some of the flavors in the old whiskey. Because old whiskey can be old whiskey, I'm finding that it balances some of the heavier tannins in some of those whiskeys. It seems to soften them and make them really approachable, because, people after 15 years, they're like, it's past its sweet spot. So, my challenge and goal was to be sure that it was a really approachable, really drinkable whiskey.
And Alan Winchester says, thanks for answering his questions. John Kalinowski wants to know if there's anything in the original documentation about how they did the malting. Did they use wood fire to dry the grain? They weren't using much malted barley, were they? So they probably weren't really drying the grain. They were just grinding it and fermenting it and mashing it, right?
Well, there was a kiln there. There was a malt house and kiln, so they were certainly doing with wood. So, and again, that didn't appear at the beginning of the project, but really it seems to be mid 1798.
And when did the distillery close down? It closed pretty much almost immediately after Washington's death, right?
It carried on a little longer because his nephew inherited it, Lawrence Lewis, and he ran it intermittently because the Andersons, the father and son, left Mount Vernon at some point in the early 1800s. And so without that Scottish expertise, things didn't go as well. And the last written record of whiskey being made there is 1808. 1814, they're trying to restart it, and a fire occurs there. And we were talking about safety, and it burns the building down. So that was the end of the story at that point.
And Whiskey Canuck in Montreal asks if you're able to source appropriate ancient or heirloom grains to distill, or are you trying to match them up to modern varieties of grain?
It's been modern up until recently. So we're on the verge of a small batch of heirloom grains, which is neat because we have the same grains we've been finding that were in the records. So, but we're going to do a pilot batch, and that's one of the things we'd like to do in the future. And that's another aspect of whiskey and distilling that I've learned from Lisa, because she's worked with heirlooms probably more than most people I know, and including even back with Ted Huber at Starlight. So that's where I first started to understand about this. And we've been milling these in the grist mill for a baker. So I think we're just embarking on that journey.
Comment from Henry Elsa, sir. When we're on the other side, maybe you could have retired brewers and distillers like me volunteer like they do at the national parks.
I can tell when things are better. We're going to have some excellent labor at the distillery. So
Yes.
Yeah, plenty of people want to work there. I wouldn't mind working down there for a week or so. My back might give out after the first day or two, but
we'd love to have you. You know,
we could. We'll talk about it. That would make a fun thing to do sometime.
Yeah.
And Graham Fraser wants to know how advanced was the distillery back then compared to other distilleries of the time. It wasn't the biggest commercially, but very productive and very well selling, right?
It was very productive, and it had most of the good components, but it did not have everything that some distilleries had, because there's a rum distillery in Alexandria that actually had a water wheel that drove agitators to row the fermentation. So there are some other advancements, and so often we wish we had a second wheel at Mount Vernon when we're rowing mash.
And John Burns, you can't beat the old heirlooms. The quantity is less, but the flavor is quality. Tor Christensen, so cool. You've got a great universal selling proposition. Nurse Dave wants to try it side by side with the same new make in less seasoned barrels, and I assume he's talking about this one. So I'm going to go ahead and I could smell this one with a glass a foot away. I could smell this. Oh, that's nice. I'm getting like baked apples, a little bit of black cherry. No tannins at all, like you were saying, Lisa. And then the taste. And you two, while I sip this, you two can answer this one. If you have 2 minutes to quickly browse in a bottle shop and you must buy one bourbon and one scotch, what would you buy? So you two go ahead and try that. Answer that one while I sip this for a second.
Let's just use the closest liquor store to where I am right now. And when I get up and walk a couple blocks, and I asked Ron, I go in and say, okay, Ron, what are you drinking now? And then I'll buy what the liquor store owner is drinking now, because he's like, oh, well, we just got this because this is what X, Y, and Z. And so lots of times he knows a lot more than I do about what new releases are and what's on the market. And so I like to do the same thing in wine shops. I like to ask the shop owner, what are you drinking right now? And yeah, that's non-committing to any brand. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah. Nice job, Lisa. Steve?
I tend to go to a little more of the Widow Jane products, because there's 2 or 3 different releases out, which is, I'm being honest, they're here in Virginia. And then on the Scotch side, I gravitate toward Glenmore and G. I often find I enjoy that. Or on some occasions, the Lefroy, because John's been a friend for a few years. And so I like, it was an acquired taste at first, but I really do enjoy Lefroy.
And Graham Fraser, still curious if those are Christmas lights. We explained this at the start of the show, Graham, but Lisa, for people who jumped in late, explain the lights behind you.
Well, Graham, things like I've said at the beginning of the show, because we don't have anybody on tours here, things are getting a little loose these days. And so one of my distillers, Sienna, her desk is back here, and we've always had the lights on the barrels, but she must have reprogrammed to be Snoopy's doghouse. And so anyway, they're flashing a little bit more than they normally do. But it's Widow Jane. We're a little quirky around here.
And Nurse Dave wants to know if this the Vault's 15-year-old is available nationwide. I'm betting it's available in limited amounts.
It is. We did 520 cases, 6-bottle cases, and distribution. If you'll email us at info@widowjane.com, I can't keep up. Not all the releases are in all the states, but like the 10 years in. We're in 45, 47 states now, and somewhere between 20 and 30 countries. So, which is, when you say it out loud, it's a little overwhelming. But if you'll email us here, we are incredibly busy, but we answer every email in our own little way. So it might take a day or two for you to get an answer back, but we'll put you in contact with some of our sales force and be able to figure out if there's any bottles left anywhere.
Well, what I'm getting on the palate on this is a lot of baked fruits, almost like a berry cobbler, apple pie type taste. A little bit of cherry in there, as I said, on the nose. Very subtle spices, but hardly any oak at all. No tannins to speak of, and just very fruity and well balanced, and really, really good. And I don't say this very often, but I have never had a bad whiskey that Lisa has made.
Thank you.
And I mean that seriously. So
I appreciate that very much.
Let's see, we're getting other comments from Malt Mariners, Lefroy close second, or Bunnahabhain, or Deanston, or Glenfarclas. Gosh, we could do this all night. Dave Cunard by a Russell's Reserve single barrel of Port Charlotte Isla barley. Graham Fraser wants to look for your whiskeys in Scotland. You're in the UK, right?
We are. I can't tell you where. Graham, if you will email me at lisa@widowjane.com or info@widowjane.com, I will put you in touch with Salvador, our person that's overseas, and he'll be able to help you locate it.
And Graham, if you need to, if you didn't get a chance to write that down, check with me and I'll get you the email address and we'll pass that along so that you can track those down. Well worth searching out. Give us the Widow Jane story real quickly, because a lot of these whiskeys came from Kentucky originally, but you are distilling more and more in Brooklyn.
Correct. It's like I tell people we have a split personality. We definitely source and blend, and that's the foundation of all, our product line right now. From Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And then the other part of what we're doing is our heirloom corn project, and I'm laying barrels down. We lay them down here. We'd have some corn growing in upstate New York, some seed corn and production corn. That production corn comes here to this facility. I'm supposed to be building a larger facility, but COVID has sort of, put the brakes on that for a minute. And then the remainder of it, I had the rest of the corn grown. It's an open pollinated heirloom cross between Wapsie Valley and Bloody Butcher. For 2 years in a row, we had the largest heirloom whiskey corn crop in the United States. Bernard Peterson grows it for us in Kentucky. He grows for lots of the big names, and we were his first craft project. And then I distilled out at Castle and Key. I use my heirloom protocol, which is a little bit funky, and their staff and our corn. And I've laid down thousands of barrels there. So what the idea was, I used to say I wanted to repatriate everything within 3 years. COVID has taken away my timeline. So I'm going to repatriate everything to New York as fast as I can get it here. But so anyway, we've got lots of irons in the fire. And what else are you going to do during COVID though, right?
And Chris Ratcliffe came in with an answer. Both Master of Malt and the Whiskey Exchange both stock the Widow Jane whiskeys in the UK, so they can ship into Scotland. So there's two sources right there.
Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.
Well, we've gone over an hour, and it's Friday night, so let's call it a night. Any final thoughts from either of you?
Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you. Normally by this time of year, I would have run into you a few places. Yeah,
multiple places. We would have Whiskey Fest or any number of places.
Yeah, and I always enjoy working with Steve. So yeah, this is the best. It's the best. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And then,
Mark, thank you for having me too, just to tell the story. And it's been a good ride for the history of whiskey at Mount Vernon, and I think we're positioned for some good years here and some products to come. So, and appreciate Lisa's input and guidance to make that happen in the more efficient and better way, certainly than 2016. So,
and when things change, if you're traveling and you make the trip out to Washington D.C., Mount Vernon is just really a few minutes south in Alexandria, Virginia. Follow the signs, and the distillery is about 3 miles west of the main estate, just off of US 1.
And I do hope, and you were there last time, but we do have a George Washington Whiskey Festival in if we see how the summer goes and the fall is, stay tuned. We might be able to offer that event maybe on a smaller scale, but we'd love to have people come visit Mount Vernon because there's something there for everybody to see.
If you, wait a second here. We have a question from Chris Tatsenko down in Australia. He would like to find out some details on the 10-year-old Widow Jane that he has in Australia from 2016, which he likes to get out at special times. Lisa, do you have any details on that one, or was that before you joined Widow Jane?
Yeah, that's before I joined Widow Jane. I joined Widow Jane. Did I join Widow Jane that year? It's going to be 4 years this spring that I've been with Widow Jane. I was a consultant for a couple of years before I came on as the distiller and president. Is there a possibility at 216 you still have a single barrel? So one of the things I was hired to do was take the Widow Jane 10-year single barrel and turn that into a small batch blended whiskey over 3 states. We did not want to drop the 10-year age statement on it. And so in order to supply that and make that an interesting whiskey, we decided to start blending that. We still offer those single barrels because they're getting older. Last year we rebranded that as Lucky 13. And those are still some of the original. They had Kentucky barrels at one point and then Indiana barrels, and there's some fabulous juice in there. Yeah. Those barrels are yielding less and less, and the whiskey just keeps getting better. It's like, angel share.
Well, let's call, and Chris said, yes, it is a single barrel. So that is the one he's talking about. So.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you get a prize. Yeah.
So we'll call it a night with that. And thank you for joining us. And hopefully we'll have some good news on tariffs dropping at some point on both sides of the Atlantic. And hopefully COVID vaccines getting wider distribution and we can all start traveling again, because I'm getting bored sitting here in the basement all the time. I need to get out to some distilleries at some point here real soon. I need to get out there and see you guys again. It's if I have to spend much more time around here, my family is not going to be happy.
Yeah, and it's easy to drive into Brooklyn these days, Mark. You can drive into Brooklyn.
I have not been to, I have not, I'm 90 miles from New York. I have not been to New York since March. The closest, I've not been into I've not crossed over into the city. I've not been up there since March.
Yeah, my last night out was, the Whiskey Magazine Icons Award thing last year. And that feels like that was the last night out. Who knew, right? Who knew?
Well, thanks again for joining us, Steve Bashore, Lisa Wicker. Lisa's from Widow Jane and the consulting distiller at George Washington's Distillery at Mount Vernon. Steve is Director of Historic Trades at Mount Vernon and oversees the George Washington's Distillery at Mount Vernon. It'll open up in April again, COVID willing, and if you're in the area, I highly recommend stopping by and taking the tour and seeing what they're up to. So, guys, thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Mark. Take care.
Just a second here. Stand by, you two, while I say goodbye to everybody. Going to have a fun show this week. We're going to talk with the guys from the 10th Street Distillery in San Jose, California. Folks that came out of the engineering world and decided they wanted to make whiskey and decided that making whiskey is a hell of a lot more fun than doing engineering work. So we will have that this weekend for you, along with the latest whiskey news. And I'll share my real tasting notes for the Widow Jane, the Vault's aged 15 years, and other whiskeys as well. And I hope you'll join us for the webcast this week. Doug McIver from Berry Brothers and Rudd joins us next Friday night on the Happy Hour webcast. You don't hear much about Doug, but he is one of the best whiskey noses in the business. He's the guy that picks all the single casks for Berry Brothers and Rudd, along with creating the Blue Hanger blend and some of the other blends that Berry Brothers produces as well. And just a wealth of knowledge, and I've been wanting to get him on the show for a while. He'll be joining us next Friday night on the Happy Hour webcast. So if you're celebrating Burns Night Monday night, Slan Chava, enjoy your haggis if you can find it. I'm going to try to see if I can find some around here. I doubt it seriously, but you never know. At the very least, I have some haggis-flavored potato crisps to enjoy on Burns Night. Take care of yourselves, wear your masks, take good care of each other, and we'll see you next week, gang. Good night, all.